Joining me now, Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Senator Coons, thank you so much for being here today. I know that obviously it's been a busy and difficult week for a lot of Americans, and certainly everybody has been strained, and you have a lot of things going on in your own life, I know. So we wish you well on all of that with regard to your parents. And so give me a little sense of, one of the things that I thought was interesting that you brought up was Arthur Brooks's message. Arthur Brooks has been a guest on this show. I think our viewers are familiar with him. But what was his message at the beginning of the breakfast today?
Well, Arthur Brooks was the keynote speaker who shared, obviously, the podium with President Trump, who also addressed the crowd. And Arthur Brooks, the title of his remarks was "Love Thy Enemies." And he gave a very compelling speech about how Christ calls us not just to civility, not just to tolerance, but to genuinely open our hearts to and love those who are our opponents, who persecute us, who are our enemies in a very real sense. And it was a funny speech. It was a challenging speech. It was an uplifting speech. And obviously, both Speaker Pelosi and President Trump were in the room and at the dais with him, as were dozens of members of Congress, both houses and the cabinet. And one of the things I was proud of about his remarks and about how the Republican and Democratic member of the House who co-chair the House prayer breakfast about their remarks was that they showed to our guests at the prayer breakfast today, who represent more than 100 countries from around the world, the best of how we are at times able to rise above our differences here in Congress and in the United States.
Let's listen to the president today, hot off of his acquittal, which obviously he's very relieved and happy about. And here's what he had to say at the breakfast this morning.
I don't like people who use their faith as justification for doing what they know is wrong. Nor do I like people who say, I pray for you, when they know that that's not so.
So the bald man, Arthur Brooks, at the table there, who leaned over to grab a sip of water during that moment, may have been reacting in some ways to what the president said. What did you think about that moment? What was it like?
I was uncomfortable. I think it was an unfortunate focus on rejecting the offers of others, their prayers for him, for the president. I don't know if that was in any way directed at my article or at my having prayed for and with the president 3 years ago. I suspect it was more focused on the contest of the moment of today. Look, Martha, we all have sharp differences in terms of our politics and our views here in Washington. But the point of the prayer breakfast is not to question each other's faith or to challenge each other, but to welcome and to accept the prayers of others and to try and seek some encouragement and uplift. The way the prayer breakfast actually started was President Eisenhower communicated to a group of senators. He said, the White House can be the loneliest house in America. It's a very hard place to bear the burdens of the office. And he asked for a chance to come and pray with senators. And in my editorial in the Post, I reference how 3 years ago, President Trump invited me to travel with him to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware as he welcomed home the remains of Ryan Owens, a Navy SEAL who had been killed in Yemen. It was the first combat death of his presidency. And I reflected on how heavy the office must have felt on his shoulders that night as we stood next to each other and a flag-draped coffin came out of the back of an American C-17 and his family received his remains for the first time. I'm mindful of how heavy the burden of the office is on any president. And I have prayed for every president, and I've done so for President Trump as well.
And you wrote in that beautifully in that editorial that you also saw that the moment was impactful for the president as well, that you could see that he was feeling the weight of the burden of that moment and of the presidency. Nancy Pelosi weighed in on this too, sort of firing back at the president, questioning whether or not he understands prayer. Here's that.
If the president understands about prayer or people who do pray, but we do pray for the United States of America. I pray hard for him because he's so off the track of our Constitution, our values, our country.
I mean, I think you just wait for somebody to sort of take the high road here in some of these situations. I just wonder what your reaction is to that. I think, prayer is such a personal thing. Judging anybody's ability to pray or the way they pray or whether or not they understand prayer just seems over the line.
Well, what I thought was the highlight of the prayer breakfast this morning was when the Republican and Democrat, Congressman Swozey of Long Island and Molinar of Michigan, who are the co-chairs of the House prayer breakfast, opened in prayer and showed through the dynamic between them just what a warm and genuine relationship they have that they've developed through praying together. Of course they have differences. Of course they have political disputes. And so do many of us. And in the article that I wrote, I try to be clear that I strongly disagree with some of the president's policy priorities. But we can't let that prevent us from being open to each other and seeking to work together. Because honestly, what I hear from Delaware week in and week out is, why can't you guys get along? Why can't you solve our country's problems? We are just coming off a very divisive fight over impeachment. I voted to remove the president, and I could understand how he would feel insulted by that vote. I feel strongly about my having come to the right conclusion. But that still doesn't prevent me from earnestly praying for our country, for my fellow senators, and for our leaders, and in particular our president. And I would hope that out of the spirit of today's breakfast, folks who visited us from around the world would get to see some of the positives of how we are able to come together, even in the midst of this very difficult and divisive moment.
Well, maybe they did. There's a psalm, lean not unto thine own understanding, which I think is powerful as well, because we all just are doing the best we can in this difficult times and trying to get through it all. Thank you so much, Senator Coons. Good to see you tonight, as always. Thank you.
Thank you.